Hello, everybody. I'm Robert Franz, music director of your Windsor Symphony Orchestra, and I am thrilled today to be sitting down and chatting with Maxime Goulet, composer Maxime Goulet. Welcome, Maxime.
Hello.
So good to have you. So I came across your music, actually. The first piece that I came across was the beach ball piece. I found it somehow online, and I watched this video, and I couldn't get over it. So for audiences, members who haven't seen this piece, basically what happens is that the audience does sort of crowd surfing with a gigantic beach ball, and it's somehow connected to the video screen above the orchestra, and they're moving the pieces around like a large video game. How in the world does that work? How does it connect up with the ball? And where did you come up with this idea of using the crowd as sort of like the joystick of this video game in a concert hall?
So this piece that I composed was in a concert about video games. So it was for the 375th anniversary of Montreal. We did because Montreal is a big city of video game. There's more than 300 video game company in Montreal, and it was the anniversary of the city. We were looking for something to celebrate that. And so I got the idea to do a video game music concert with games that are made in Montreal. Yep. And so we had a lot of different things, and there's already a lot of video game concert that exists. But one of the major thing about video game music that is unique to it, it's that it's interactive. Because if you compare to film music is also following the image. When it's intense, the music gets intense. But when you play a video game, yeah, it follows the image, but you never know how the image will evolve, because the player can turn right or turn left, and the music will evolve differently depending on how the player plays the game. So I wanted to have this dimension of interactive music in the concert, because for me it's so related to video game music. So I was looking for a way. One of the ways that I found is doing that, because we had a certain moment in the concert where somebody was playing a video game and the orchestra was following the performance of the player. But that was fun for one person playing the video game, but I thought it would be fun that everybody could play that video game and had that feeling that the orchestra is following my performance,
Sure.
So I made some research to see how are people doing crowd gamings, and there's a lot of different experiments about doing crowd gaming. And one thing that I used for my piece was to have like you were explaining, it's a huge beach ball that the crowd can. So everybody that goes like in rock concert have experienced that, where you can all the people work together to move the ball in one direction or the other. The thing that was unique about it is that on screen, you also had an image with the ball, and the ball was moving in the same direction as the crowd was moving the ball. And on the screen, we added some elements. So sometimes you had some stars, you had to catch the stars, so you have to move the ball so that on screen the ball go catch the stars or avoid some meteorites and stuff like that. So, and the orchestra has to follow. So if you catch a star, the orchestra has to go to ling, and if you get touched by the meteorites, you have a feedback from the orchestra if you did the right thing or not, or if there's not a lot of time left, the music will go faster if you win or lose, all these kind of things that are really related to video game music experience. Bring that into the concert, and that everybody can experience having their own personal orchestra playing the soundtrack of the performance. Yeah.
So I mean, everything about this I love, and I fell in love with the music. I fell in love with the concept right away. But what I discovered about you pretty quickly thereafter, was that you have written so many genres of music. You've written operas, you've written symphonic pieces, you've written plenty of video games, lots of video game soundtracks. In fact, I have to tell you that I was talking to my middle daughter, who is 17 years old, and I asked her, I said, have you played any of these games? And so I went down through the list. And she said, yeah, I played Warhammer 40,000 and Roller Coaster Tycoon. And I said, oh, yeah? What were they like? She said, they were great. They're great games to play. I said, well, I'm doing an interview with the composer of the music. And she was like, oh, it was it was super cool for her, which, I just have to say, Maxime, anything that makes me super cool to a 17-year-old daughter is like, I'm really super grateful for that. There is a lot of video game music, and we will get to the piece that we're going to perform here in a second, but there is a lot of video game music that is coming out of Montreal, because there's so many video gamers and video games that are created in Montreal. Do you have an idea of how that happened to be? Why is Montreal such a hub for video game creation?
Well, there's many factors. One of the factors was that there was a governmental effort to bring video game company in Montreal. So they did some some good tax incentive to bring the companies here, saying like you know the first years that you open your studio, you'll have like less tax to pay and this and that, and we'll help you fund the studio. They wanted also to regroup all the studios in the same location, which didn't work in the end. But so they did a lot of effort to try to attract video game company here. And once big companies started coming here, that created a lot of employees that are people that are good. So other companies says like, well, let's go to Montreal. There's that big studio. We'll open a studio right in front of it. We'll send email to the employees, say, come work with us and we'll double your salary. And that's how other came in. So it kind of created a bubble, you know, an effect where everybody kind of said like, well, there's a lot of people who know how to do video game there because there's those company there. So let's go to the studio there. So there was a lot of factor that kind of brought all that companies and studios. And after that, what was really interesting is that it started by big studios opening, like Ubisoft and so on. And after that, there was also like a big wave of independent games. So that was also very interesting because what people who doesn't play a game don't know is that it's a little bit like film. You know, in film you have the big blockbusters, but you have also like indie film that sometimes have like a film done by a handful of people, and it can be really a good film that win prize in festival and stuff like that. And sometimes by having something that is smaller and you can do something that is more creative, more daring, and so you kind of also push the line of what can be done and so on, and it also influence what the majors are doing because they're looking at that little game that did something super creative with a handful of people, and they say like, we should do something like that. So there's kind of this ecosystem where it's kind of everybody inspired each other, you know. And because of big studio, a lot of some of these employees after that, after a few years, they were like, well, let's start our own independent company to do the game that we really want to do. So it kind of really builds up all together. Yeah.
Wow, very interesting. Now, I remember from my music history studies that when films started to become a thing, major composers, Shostakovich, Prokofiev, Ravel, they all wanted to get in on the action and write music for films. Nowadays, it's a little bit sort of separated, right? You have more sort of film composers and more sort of classical concert composers, although there's some crossover, but it's a little bit more separate than it used to be. You are obviously a trained classical composer. I mean, your mastery of the orchestra as a creative being, as a composer, is really impressive, and the way the sounds that you pull out of the orchestra are really pretty incredible. How did you become involved in this wave of video game composition? I sort of see it as a similar trajectory in a way to how films first began to be written for, how music was written for films originally. Now the new sort of version of that is video games. How did you become involved with composing music for video games?
It was really like, again, multiple factors put together. When I studied in university, there was no course like nowadays. There's course of, if you want to be a film composer or a video game composer, there's course on how to compose. I actually teach a course in university on how to write music for video games. But back then, when I was studying, there was none of that, you know. So everybody was kind of learning it by their own. So I studied as a training as a classical composer and writing for, you know, live orchestra and stuff like that. And while I was doing my studies, I was assistant for a film composer, a well-established film composer. So I learned also a lot about writing for music for image while being his assistant. And I always liked and enjoy working with some visuals, and that you can even see it in my concert pieces work. And when I graduated, my sister was working for a video game company in Montreal, and she said, oh, there's a lot of video game companies in Montreal. You should look around and try to find if there's some opportunity there, you know. So I started to look around, and there was one company, Game Lab, that had a job opening for looking for an in-house composer. They already had a team of house composer, and one left, so they were looking for somebody to replace. So I applied there, and I got the job, and it was really an interesting opportunity, because usually when you write for film or video game, you're a freelancer. So you're hired only for one specific project and for that length of the project. And once the project is over, you know, you have to find the other projects and sometimes do a few at the same time. But when I was working for Game Lab, since I was an in-house, I had my office in the video game company. So I was composer 9 to 5. A lot of my composer find it very funny. They say, how can you find inspiration from, specifically 9 to 5, 5 days a week? But it was really also a good learning school because we were a team of 10 composers. And we were all helping each other, because when you're a composer, usually you're always alone in your room composing, and you just see the light of the day when you bring out your score to the orchestra, right? But when I was working for the video game, if I'm composing something and I want to have advice, I can ask my colleagues who's just next door and say, hey, come listen to that. What do you think about this? And he can give me some suggestions, this and that. So it was really fun for that, specifically because there was no training on how to write this interactive music. I was talking earlier about music that follows the image. How can you write something that always evolves and that never sounds the same? So by having kind of this team of composers that each time somebody discovered something, we would share it with the other.
So when you write music for a video game, are you writing kind of like components, and those components like little pods of music that kind of get shifted around, or is there more of a through line, or how does that work? Yeah,
there's a lot of different technique to do it. So one of the simplest is like a multi-track. So imagine that you record an orchestra where you have the strings, the brass, and the woodwinds, but you all record them separately.
Okay.
And when you play the video game, you play these 3 tracks, and only the strings are at volume 100%, and you lower the volume of the brass and the woodwind. So the music plays, and if events happen and you want to raise tension, you raise the volume of the brass. So the brass won't start back at measure 1.
I see.
The same. So the music will get more intense because you're adding more instrument or you're removing instruments. So that's an easy way to kind of add or remove tension or this and that, or you add some percussion or stuff like that, Other types of interactive music could be to have 2 different versions of the same music, and like one ambient and one intense. So like in the ambient, the theme will be played by the violin, and then the intense version, that same theme will be played by the brass. And I will cross-fade from one version to the other. So instead of just adding or removing, I'm actually changing the timbre of what instrument is playing the theme or this and that, So there's a lot of ways. And there's also, as you mentioned, ways of composing little bits. This is also very useful as you're playing a game that you spend a lot of time in an environment. Let's say you're playing and you're staying 2 hours in the forest. You don't want to have a 2-minute piece that will be looping 60 times. It will get really annoying. So you can compose little fragments that will be played in a random order so that the music always changes, and you always have have I heard that? I'm not sure, no, because they always resequence each other. Yeah.
Wow. Very interesting. Well, I love that very much. But getting back to your symphonic music for a second, you've written a piece, the beach ball game piece, which I mentioned before, a piece called United Anthems, which includes 35 national anthems from around the world. Symphonic Factory for Kids, which is this great piece where kids are actually involved on stage. A bassoon circus, which is a bassoon concerto with a bassoonist dressed as a clown, which is amazing. The piano concerto that accompanies a chess match. One idea after the other. And then this piece that we're performing, Symphonic Chocolates, which I want to dig down into Symphonic Chocolates, because it puts together 2 of my favorite things in the world, classical music and chocolate. But before we do that, I want to know, generally speaking, where do you come up with these ideas? Do you have like 1,000 ideas a day and you throw away 999 of them? Or is there some sort of process that you go through? Or how does your mind work, Maxime? How does this happen?
Let's have a look.
I know.
So, the way I work is I have like a notebook, and I write all ideas, because a lot of the ideas I have them in everyday life. So for example, for Symphonic Chocolate, one day I went into a chocolate shop and I was reading the description of the chocolate, and it was talking about texture, about mix of flavor, about contrast. And I felt like, it's interesting. We have that in music too. We have contrast, mix of flavors and all and textures. So I was like, why don't I write a piece following the description of chocolates? And then I got the idea, I can also have the audience to eat the chocolate while the piece is being performed. So it's like a soundtrack for chocolate tasting. So the idea kind of started with little something. I write that in my notebook, and if I think about it, I talk about it with musician or orchestra, and then I have another idea that kind of comes with it and kind of build up with it. Like, for example, there's another piece, it's called Fishing Story, and it's a clarinet concerto, and the clarinetist is dressed up as a fisherman, and there's a little prop boat on stage, and when he comes in, his clarinet is like his oar where he rows and plays arpeggio, and then it's like a fishing stick where he throws the line. and then he waits for the fish to bite. So he's playing kind of lyrical music, kind of trying to seduce the fish. And when the fish bites, he tries to pulls it out. So it gets very virtuoso, you know, and it works out pretty. The way I got the idea is just I went to see a concert of a clarinetist friend, and the way he was playing, you know, sometimes clarinetist soloists, they move a lot.
Sure.
You know, it's like a fishing stick. So I just had that really naive and simple idea. So I just wrote it down. I just said, it's clarinetist like a fishing, you know, and then I wrote it down. And then I had one, like, I don't know, maybe 1 or 2 years later, I had a concert in Toronto, and concert, there's someone that come up to me and says, I'm Cornel Wallach, I'm a clarinetist, and I went to the concert because there was a Jan Nishinsky in the concert and all the Polish community was invited. But what I really like is your piece. It was like incredible. We should, it was just a string piece that I wrote for that concert. And he said, we should do something together. And he says, I'm really into movement and mime while I play. So I was like, that's interesting. You know, he's a clarinetist and he likes to move. And I had in my notebook this idea of doing something with a fisherman. So these two ideas connected together. And then I was also in contact with an orchestra who wanted to do a piece. And I was like, well, maybe this could be the opportunity. You know, so sometimes that's why I always say, like, never underestimate a simple and naive idea, because you never know where it's going to lead. You know, just write down the clarinetist looks like a fisherman, and then it ends up like a concerto that has been performed like in Poland, Ecuador, throughout Canada, so it's been, you know, so sometimes I think what helps me is that I'm always very naive, I think, and thinking like, that could be a good idea, even though a lot of people would have disregarded that idea, you know, so I always give the chance to the idea to make it through.
Are there any ideas that you've had that were like really, truly terrible? Or are there any ideas that you've had that you were thinking, I really want to make this happen and it just can't yet? Like it's hard to get over that hurdle.
That often, I mean, because I have a lot of, and I know also that I won't get through my notebook in a lifetime, because I'm just adding much more than I'm able to compose piece as fast. So there's so many ideas. So usually when I work with, not usually, but often when I work with an orchestra, like an orchestra wants to commission me a piece, and one of the things that the orchestra likes is that these kind of concept, you know, so they feel they can attract new audience and so on. It's good, it's easy to marketing and stuff like that. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll suggest them some ideas. So I'll pull out my notebook and they say, like, we want to do a piece for either it's an event or this and that, and I can suggest them some ideas that kind of work with what their concert and what's the other piece in the concert and this and that. So for example, there was a piece that I wrote, it's called What a Day, and each movement is a different moment of the day. So the first movement is morning, after that is long day at work, a romantic evening, and the night after that, and the serene night. And the idea of that is that it was also a metaphor that the day is a bit like a lifetime. It's like a microcosm, because the morning, joyful, is a bit like youth and when you're a kid, you know, playful, and long day at work is a bit like the days in school where you're learning a lot of things like a factory. And then romantic evening is more like the romantic part of the life, and the serene night is more like wisdom and looking back, and I'm taking back the themes that we heard before and so on. So it's kind of a microcosm. And this piece was actually played in a concert where there was the Four Seasons of Vivaldi and the Four Seasons of Piazzolla. So they were playing both Four Seasons, and they asked me, like, could you find a concept that would work within that concert for string orchestra, of course. So I was like, I don't want to do another Four Seasons, but instead of like the Four Seasons of Vivaldi is like it's a four concerto. Sure. Movement. So it's like each movement is 1 month of the year. So we have the 12 months of the year in total at the end. So instead of taking a year and breaking it down in 4 or in 12, I could take a day and breaking it down in 4, or a lifetime and break. So it was the same concept, and it worked well with that concert, you know. So by talking with the orchestra, I kind of tried to develop. Also, I have a lot of the idea, but what idea could fit with them? And sometimes it's an idea that I don't know where the idea will lead, but when I put it in the angle of what they're trying to do, I say, I can take this idea and just turn it like that, twist it like that, and it actually could really fit well. And it's actually the key also to resolving how can I make this idea happen. But it happens sometimes that some idea that I want to do, and I suggested it to a few orchestra, and nobody really kind of kicks on it. But I'm just thinking like, well, maybe it's not ready yet. You know, my idea is a bit like my kids. You know, maybe it's not ready to leave home yet. You know,
that's right.
So on. Yeah.
Well, I love the fact that you are so incredibly collaborative as well. It sounds like it's a real rich sort of back and forth with the artist and the orchestra to determine, you know, kind of what step you take next. Take us through symphonic chocolates. Take us into this piece. What should audiences expect to hear?
Well, a few things. I think each movement, since each movement evoke a different flavor of chocolate, they all have their own kind of world in terms of mood and emotion. So the first movement is caramel chocolate. So it's very soft, because when you think about caramel, you think about something like leaking and sticky, and
Yes.
the melody is very lyrical, played by the cello and the viola, and the other orchestra. The rest of the orchestra is just playing a very, very rich texture, kind of impressionistic, a bit like Ravel type of Debussy type of music. And so this is for the first movement, caramel chocolate. The second movement is dark chocolate. So dark chocolate, I did something that was more, because dark chocolate for me is a bit more like seduction and passion. And so I took rhythms of tango and habanera in it.
Yeah.
And also like with dark chocolate, you have a bit of bitterness, also. So I wanted to spice it up. And so there's a bit more dissonance. Sometimes the two counter melody, they kind of very close by, create some frictions. So that's for the second movement, dark chocolate. The third movement is mint chocolate. So this time, what inspired me is really the feeling. When we eat mint, it's very fresh in our mouth. It's almost feeling cold when we eat something related to mint. So I wanted to create that kind of cold feeling. So you'll hear right from the start of the movement, you hear kind of a wind sound that kind of already takes us away. Maybe it's the fact that I live in Montreal, where it's really cold winter, that I'm really easily inspired by those kind of and you hear also the violin playing a tremolo sul ponticello, but it kind of makes an icy cold, really sharp sound. And all that movement is very kind of moody, kind of almost like Debussy-esque, like really it's hard to feel a pulse. It's really like a cloud passing by. And the last movement is coffee-infused chocolate. So for this movement, I was inspired by the origin of coffee. So for me, coffee is a lot Brazil. There's a lot of samba and coho rhythm into that piece. And also when I drink coffee, I really feel energetic. So the piece is really fast-paced, and it's always on the go from beginning to end. It's also, it main features the first flute also. And also what's interesting, the string player, are playing pizzicato, but instead of playing just one, they're playing a strumming pizzicato, which is a bit like a little guitar or a little Brazilian instrument, something like that. So that's also, so it's interesting that in each movement, I'm inspired by a different aspect of the chocolate. So for example, the coffee is the origin of coffee. The mint is the feeling cold of mint. Whereas for caramel, it's the texture. So each time it's in the dark chocolate, it's the passion, is what it evokes. So it's like, so it shows that taste is not just one thing, but it's really multiple things, And that's one of the aspects that I really like about this project, is that when you eat, almost all your sense are involved. You have the taste, you have the texture, you have the smell, almost all the sense except the sound. The sound is a bit involved, but when somebody, because you hear yourself chewing, but when the person is making chocolate, they're not thinking about the sound it will make when you bite in it. So by adding a custom soundtrack to it, it makes a really complete multi-sensory experience, because all the senses are really involved. And memory is really impacted by this combination of different senses. The more you have sense involved, the more your memory will remember something, There's some people who heard that piece, Symphonic Chocolate, 5 years ago, and they still remember going to the concert, eating the chocolate, If it was the exact same music and it was just called Symphony Number 12, not sure if they would have remembered it as much, So there's that thing also. I was actually even invited to do a conference in the Multisensory International Conference to talk about symphonic chocolate, because there are some scientific studies about does sound influence taste and stuff like that. And they even did some tests on sound and taste of chocolate. Does certain sound influence the certain taste of chocolate? And that study was done. I wasn't aware of that. When I did my composition was very intuitive, saying like lyrical goes with caramel and spicy go with staccato.
Yeah.
They did a scientific study with blind tests and stuff like that, and they came to the same result.
Wow.
And when I met that person, he sent me the result of his study, and I read his things. I was like, that's incredible, because it's really it was really interesting for him too, to see that intuitively a composer will come to the same conclusion as somebody that did scientific research about it. It's really interesting. Yeah.
Really incredible. So So the idea is that audience members in their own homes will grab these 4 flavors of chocolates and then eat them just at the beginning of each of those. And during the performance, we will share with people when to eat which chocolate. So we'll send out ahead of time the list of chocolates so everybody has them prepared just in case they don't have one of them at home. I also think it would be an interesting experiment to see if people ate the wrong chocolates, how they would feel like at each movement. I think, have you tried that?
Yes, actually, I tried when I did the when I was invited at the multi-sensory conference. Before I give my conference, I did a test where I brought my laptop with an excerpt of each movement, but they were not identified. It was just A, B, C, D. Yeah. And I had a little paper with the 4 flavor, and they had to listen to the music and try to associate which music corresponds to which flavor. Yeah. I wanted to see, is it obvious, do they come to the same conclusion as I did, And for the most part, it was successful. One interesting thing that I realized that they reversed was the mint in the coffee. And that was really surprising for me because coffee for me is so energetic. How can you? But then I realized by talking to people, they say, well, when I drink a coffee, it's coffee break, so it's relaxing. So I associate coffee with relaxing. And the mint is relaxing as the slow movement, and the sweet. Yes. It was interesting to see like how we can have different perception on the same elements, flavors and music. So that was a really interesting. And since it was a conference of scientists, they were really willing to participate in this kind of test, and be the to help me with that. So yeah.
Well, our staff asked me if I would take a picture of me with all of the chocolate in our house, and I said all of it, and they said yeah, all of it. And we are a bit of a chocolate family. I'm a beyond chocolate-aholic. And so I took a picture with the counter, and it was this huge mound of chocolate of every kind that you could possibly imagine. And I sent the picture in, and they just wrote back, whoa, that's a lot of chocolate.
It's actually, they wanted to have a photo so that when you bring the chocolate, they want to see if some are missing.
That's right. Exactly. That's exactly right. Well, Maxime, one last question before we go, and I really appreciate the time you're spending with me today. But the last question is this. What is your first memory of music, either playing music or composing music? What is the first thing you remember as a child?
That's a really good question. I have a lot of memories of music, even though there's no professional musician in my family. I think maybe one of the most important music in my childhood was Peter and the Wolf. Uh-huh. I had the record. I still have it actually just there with Fernandel, who does the narration, so a old French actor. Sure. And I listened to that record like over and over and over and over. And at one point I grew up and I kind of forgot about it. And then when I went into music, I study and this and that. And nowadays my favorite composer for many years is Prokofiev. So I'm wondering if there's a link there. And Prokofiev was also a film composer, Sure. And he did a lot of ballet, which is like kind of like video game music, where it's like music that accompanies movement and this and that. So there's a lot of things that I really appreciate from him. And when I look back, he's kind of my first memory of music, and I'm still like. So yes, it was love at first sight, maybe something like that.
That's awesome. That is awesome. Well, Maxime, thank you so much for spending this time with me today. And we are so looking forward to not only symphonic chocolates, but many more Goulet pieces in the future of the Windsor Symphony Orchestra. Thank you.
Well, thank you.